All right. I think our attendance rating has gone up to about 20 participants, so we've reached a pretty decent number, and I assume that people will probably join as we continue. But I think we should get started just for everybody else that's already here. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to CDFA's Community Development Block Grant Application webinar. My name is Julius Peel, and I'm a CDBG Program Administrator here at CDFA. So firstly, I want to say thank you for everybody that joined of the 20 or so folks that are watching. We anticipate that the presentation, including the time for questions, will run from now until roughly about 11:30. I would say that's going to get us right up to lunch. So again, thank you all for coming. So today we'll be providing, as I proceed our slides here, a brief overview of CDFA for those who may not be familiar with the organization, a brief overview of the CDBG program, eligibility of applicants, application process, and then also we'll have some time at the end for some questions. Before we get started, though, I'm going to cover a few technology procedures. We are recording today's session, and we will share the recording along with the presentation slides and links to relevant resources in the coming days. Now, for everyone that was interested in watching this weekend, maybe with all the nice weather that's coming, unfortunately, you're going to have to wait till probably the following for it to be uploaded online. You can find that on our YouTube, and I can put a link to that in the chat whenever I'm done presenting here. There are two ways as well if you would like to interact with the CDFA team. First is the chat box located in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. To get started, I think it would be good if everybody could take a moment to introduce themselves in the chat, starting with your name and your organization that you're here representing today. Maybe include something fun that you like to do during the summer. And then secondly is the Q&A panel located in the bottom left of the screen. We ask that all participants use this panel rather than the chat when asking questions, as Zoom records those questions for all applicants to review, and we'll label them as either answered or answered live or answered separately. Hopefully this will decrease the chances of duplicating questions and allow everybody to be equally as informed. So besides me, I would say today you're going to hear from a few of the other members of the CDFA's team, including Molly Kaler, Director of Housing and Community Development, and Chris Monroe, our Senior Community Project Manager. But before we get to that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass it along to Katie Easterly-Marte, Executive Director, to share with you a little bit more about CDFA as an organization.
Thank you so much, and it's great to have you all here today. I am going to just give you a little bit of an overview of CDFA. So CDFA is a public organization that serves all of New Hampshire. Our mission is to maximize the value and impact of community development, economic development, and clean energy initiatives across our whole state. We see a future in which New Hampshire communities are economically and socially resilient. They reflect and respect their natural surroundings and are places where people want to live, work, and play. We work to align CDFA's resources to the evolving community economic development needs across New Hampshire. CDFA invests in the people of New Hampshire by deploying a well-tuned, effective investment system, which we call our ecosystem, which I'll go through in just a minute. Enabling partners to make transformative and sustainable changes in their communities, which I know you all are doing and are coming to us today to learn more about how we can support you in that work. And we do that through the deployment of grants, loans, and tax credit equity. We also provide technical assistance across all of our program areas. So in terms of technical assistance, you'll hear more about this, but this is connecting with our staff. You can do that by requesting a pre-application meeting at the top right of our website where it says request a meeting, or we provide workshops, and as you'll hear more about, written information on our resource hub. CDFA's resources support all stages of project development in our ecosystem. So you may be here today with a very early stage project in the concept initiation stage, where we help to catalyze a new idea, promote innovation, and support organizational capacity to carry out that idea. The majority of the funding to support this concept initiation comes from our tax credit program, which has applications due each March. So if you're interested in some capacity building to support your project, your organizational capacity, your project idea, that's a great place to start. Access to funds to determine the viability of a project is the next and really critical stage in the process. So we deploy a variety of resources to support planning and development. Activities in planning and development include things like market studies, early architectural and engineering, And we support these through the Community Development Block Grant Planning Grants, which are rolling applications of up to $25,000 to support those activities. Pre-development loans of up to $100,000, and these are determined in terms of an interest rate on the alignment of your project with CDFA's mission. So the interest rate is lower, the more aligned your project is. So we'd encourage you to consider that if you need support for your planning and development activities. And then the largest portion of CDFA's resources support the implementation of your community development, economic development, and clean energy projects. This includes the Community Development Block Grant, which you'll hear more about today, tax credit equity, which again, those are $5 million of tax credits available in an allocation through competitive round, which is applications due in March of every year. Clean energy loans, those can really complement our CDBG application for grant resources, and those clean energy loans are available at any time. And all of these phases of our work, we provide continuous engagement and support. We want to understand your project. We want to help you align our resources to your project idea so that you're successful. Now we want to help you navigate our application and review process, which is what today's webinar will be the beginning of, and connect you with other potential funding resources. The impact of CDFA's investment ecosystem can be seen in revitalized downtowns, high-quality childcare facilities, renovated housing, clean energy projects, business expansion to provide jobs, and a healthy and vibrant nonprofit sector. We look forward to working with you on the project that you have in mind, and we hope that the Community Development Block Grants are part of the financing that will bring that project to fruition. To talk about the Community Development Block Grant Program, we are going to have Molly Kaler be the next speaker to introduce the program. Thanks, Molly.
Thank you, Katie. And good morning, everybody. Thanks again for joining us today. I'm going to now move into talking a little bit more about the CDBG program. CDBG was established under the Housing and Community Development Act of 1974, and it was developed to address a wide range of housing and community development needs. The primary statutory objectives of CDBG are to develop viable communities by providing decent housing and a suitable living environment, and expanding economic opportunities, principally for persons of low and moderate income. And through an annual formula allocation process, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, provides federal CDBG funds to both entitlement communities and states. We'll talk more about in a moment. CDFA has administered the annual allocation of CDBG funds on behalf of the state of New Hampshire since 2003, excuse me. And we've coordinated the investment of more than $150 million into New Hampshire communities. These critical resources have been deployed across the state and have made a significant impact on economic development, housing, and community-based projects in dozens of municipalities. CDFA deploys approximately $9.3 million of Community Development Block Grants, or CDBG, funds each year. As you can see here, this is a little bit, some pie charts that illustrate the funding breakdown. At the national level, it's broken, HUD CDBG funding is broken up into two primary program areas. This includes the entitlement programs and the state programs. As we discussed, or I briefly mentioned in the last slide, entitlement communities receive funds directly from HUD. So they receive their own CDBG allocation directly from HUD. The state-administered CDBG program that CDFA administers includes those units of general local government which do not receive CDBG funds directly from HUD as part of the HUD entitlement program. So you can see nationwide, on average, entitlement communities receive nearly 70% of the overall CDBG allocation each year, and then 30% goes to state-run and small city programs such as the one that we're talking about today that CDFA administers. In New Hampshire, there's a small number of entitlement communities, and they receive about a quarter of the CDBG funding overall that comes into the state, and the balance goes to CDFA. The next slide shows a little bit about how we break down the state allocation here. Our 2024 action plan, which is what we submit to HUD to outline how we are going to spend the funds, gives more detail about this breakdown. But what what you can see here is that we allocate funds principally across 3 different program areas. This includes economic development, housing, and public facilities. They all get about 30% of our annual 9.3, approximately 9.3 allocation. The rest of that funding goes to overall program technical assistance and administration. And then we also make some funds available for planning, which we'll talk more about. And then we have a small amount of funding available for projects that meet some criteria related to emergency situations. This next slide shows the flow of CDBG funding. So as you can see here, funding is allocated to HUD, by HUD, to CDFA. So the first square represents the HUD logo, and then the next square shows the CDFA logo. Then CDFA awards funding to a municipality, which is the third picture. That's supposed to be a town hall. So the funds go from CDFA to a municipality or a county grantee. Oftentimes, the municipality or county is working with an organization who is the one responsible for carrying out the project. We call that entity a subrecipient, and that's illustrated by the 4th photo. And then lastly, the project ultimately benefits low to moderate income individuals, who we call beneficiaries, or HUD calls beneficiaries. So you may hear that term. I'd like to pause here for a brief second before we get into the next part talking about eligibility. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to enter those in the Q&A box below. I'll pause a couple times throughout the presentation to answer questions. And as Julia said, if please feel free while I'm speaking or while the other presenters are speaking to type those questions right into the Q&A box. Some will answer virtually, some we may answer live throughout the presentation, and then others we may wait till the end of the presentation.
There are no questions as of this point, but we would love to see them as they come.
All right, awesome. Well, let's move on to the next section where we're going to talk a bit more about CDBG program eligibility. So CDBG is a bit different than many other grant programs that you may be familiar with when it comes to who is eligible to apply for funding. It is a federal requirement of CDBG that the applicant must be a general unit of general local government. So again, in other words, it's a municipality that the project is located in, or the county in some circumstances. Funding, as we said before, is often then subgranted to a subrecipient organization, who is the entity that carries out the project. However, grantees can also carry out projects directly. There doesn't have to be a subrecipient depending on the project. All New Hampshire counties and municipalities are eligible to apply for CDBG funds, with the exception of the 5 cities that are HUD entitlement communities that I mentioned previously. Those communities are listed here on your screen: Manchester, Nashua, Portsmouth, Rochester, and Dover. If you have a project that's located in one of those municipalities, we would encourage you to reach out directly to the municipal government to talk to them about their CDBG allocation and how you might be able to access that. But again, due to federal regulations, we're not able to grant funds to projects located in those municipalities. The next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about national objectives. So under the CDBG program, there are 3 allowable national objectives. It is to provide direct benefit to low to moderate income persons or households, to aid in the prevention or elimination of slums and blight, or to eliminate a serious and immediate threat to public health and safety, which is referred to as urgent need. In New Hampshire, for the New Hampshire CDBG program, all projects must have a direct benefit to low to moderate income individuals, and that it must be at least 51% of the beneficiaries, or the people that the project is benefiting. They must be LMI individuals. And so that's that first green circle there. So again, in New Hampshire, while nationally, there are other ways to qualify to meet a national objective. Here in New Hampshire, all CDBG projects must meet the LMI national objective, which we'll talk more about. There are 4 ways, I should mention that are outlined on the slide to how you can meet that LMI benefit. This includes by using an area benefit, by looking at limited clientele. Housing projects have their own LMI criteria, and then economic development projects have their own for job creation. So in the next couple slides, we're going to dive down a little deeper into those 4 ways that you can meet that LMI objective. The first slide here talks about area benefit. In order for a grant application to be considered under the area benefit category, the following conditions must apply. The benefit must be available to all residents of the project area, and the project area must primarily be residential in character. So again, that's important. It can't be used in a commercial or a downtown area unless it is predominantly residential. At least 51% of the beneficiaries in the project area must be low to moderate income. And again, that's meeting the HUD definition of low to moderate income. And then the 4th condition is that the applicant must conduct an income survey or use US Census data if it actually aligns perfectly with the project area to establish the percentage of LMI beneficiaries. And the survey must be statistically valid, so you need to also provide the methodology on how you conducted that survey. So these are the 4 different ways that you can potentially, the 4 different conditions that make it possible to use area benefit. We have much more information about this in our CDBG implementation guide, where we talk about the national objectives. So for all 4 categories that I'm talking about here in these next few slides, if you want more detailed information, that would be the best resource, our CDBG implementation guide, which we will be following up, and that will be one of the materials that we send to you as a follow-up to this presentation. The next category is limited clientele. Under limited clientele, the activity must benefit a specific group where at least 51% of the individuals are LMI. This is determined by qualifying under one of the following tests. One of the tests is a HUD presumed group. You can see in the box on the right-hand side of this slide, it lists out who HUD has determined to be a presumed group. If your activity that you're seeking funding for benefits one of those groups of individuals, that automatically would make your project LMI eligible. The next way is through income determination. So in order to determine if a household meets the income determination requirements, you need to look at family size and the income. And a common way of doing that is through our family income verification surveys. We make those available on our website, and we update those each year when HUD issues new income guidelines. We actually just updated those. New income guidelines came out on May 1st. And the new income verification surveys are available on our website under CDBG. Under the CDBG section, we have a tab called Income Surveys. And so the individuals that you're serving, if you're not otherwise collecting their income and family size in some other way, some projects use those forms to be able to show via income determination that the project is serving predominantly low to moderate income individuals. The next way is that if the project is of such nature and location, what this just means is that the type of activity being funded and the location of it means that they may it may be reasonably concluded that the clientele may be of low to moderate income. So say it is say there's a facility in a housing a low-income housing development, and there's a facility inside there, a childcare facility that serves the residents of that low-income housing development. That would be such an activity that might be able to use nature and location. Again, more information about limited clientele can also be found in that implementation guide that I referenced. The next category is housing activities. So if you're applying for the CDBG housing program, the housing that you're looking to have funded must serve predominantly low to moderate income individuals. For multifamily housing, the units must be affordable rents, must have affordable rents. And again, multifamily rehab. So if there's several units, at least 51% have to have occupants that will be low to moderate income individuals. If it's a duplex, it needs to be at least one of the two units, and then anything larger than that has to meet that 51% threshold. Single family housing, we're not currently funding that in New Hampshire at this time, but if that is an eligible activity in the national CDBG program, and that requires the people who are residing in that unit to be low to moderate income individuals. And then we also can sometimes, rarely fund new housing, but typically that is not eligible under CDBG. That's because there are other HUD funded programs that are designed specifically to fund new housing construction. Our partners at the New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority administer several of those programs and are often the primary funders of new construction. But however, sometimes we are able to fund it in certain circumstances if the organization doing so is a community-based development organization, which is a classification that HUD uses to designate some organizations. So if you had questions about that, we'd encourage you to reach out to us. But in general, that's not again, an area that we typically fund. Our CDBG's primary use should be in housing redevelopment. The next slide just talks about job creation or retention, which is another way to meet the LMI definition. This is for economic development, only for the economic development program. If you're applying for funding through the economic development program, the activities that are going to be funded with CDBG must either create permanent jobs on a full-time equivalent basis, and with at least 60% of those jobs being held by or made available to low and moderate income persons, or the activities must retain at least 60% low and moderate income jobs and meet the other requirements that are set forth in the regulations. So again, it's tied directly to job creation, which is new jobs, not filling existing jobs that are vacant. It's creating brand new jobs that haven't been there before, or retaining jobs. And again, the key point is that a majority of those have to be held or made available to low to moderate income individuals. So that's the end of the section talking about the national objective. We haven't seen any questions come in yet, so I'm going to move into the eligible activities portion. So again, not only do you have to be an eligible applicant to apply and then be eligible by meeting a national objective, which again is certifying that your project meets the low to moderate income objective, but then the activities that you're looking to fund must also be eligible. And so planning activities is one way that you might want to use CDBG funding. Some examples of activities that can be funded under our CDBG planning program include doing preliminary architectural and engineering design, doing cost estimates and market analysis for the project, energy audits, and sometimes income surveys if you need to hire somebody, if there's a large enough sample that needs to be income surveyed. So applicants need to design and implement studies which can be completed within a 12-month period. So again, the planning activities that we typically fund are meant to be last for a year or less, and really be preliminary activities that hopefully lead to a viable project down the road. And ideally that project would be eligible and planning to come in for CDBG implementation dollars. So we really are trying to make sure this CDBG planning resource is a resource for projects that intend to apply for CDBG further down the line. Another new opportunity that I want to mention is our transformational planning grants. And this is a new program that's being piloted currently. Program year 2023 was our first year offering this. And it's really meant to provide slightly larger amounts of funding dollars and to really not project specific planning activities, but more community level planning activities and perhaps focused on certain areas. So our first year with the pilot, we're focused on funding projects that lead to community level strategies for housing, for example. So we have more information about that in our application guide. And if you have ideas for transformational type of work, community level planning work that might need some funding, we would definitely encourage you to reach out and talk to us more about that as it's a new program and we are still in the pilot phase of that. The next activity, one of our programs that's coming up with the application deadline in July, which we'll talk more about in a bit, is our housing program. And our housing program, as the name implies, funds housing activities. The primary objective of this program is to provide housing to low to moderate income individuals. Rental and owner occupied housing is eligible, and low and moderate income homeowners and landlords that rent to LMI residents are also eligible for financial assistance. Eligibility is very nuanced, but activities include, but are not necessarily limited to the acquisition or the rehabilitation of existing housing, elderly or ADA access in those residential units. And again, like I mentioned earlier, sometimes new construction can be funded through CDBG, but it has to be completed by a HUD designated CBDO organization. Conditions of funding housing through CDBG include long-term affordability. CDFA requires that the project commit to maintaining that LMI benefit for at least for a minimum of 10 years. There are more points awarded in the application scoring process to projects that will commit to a longer affordability period. CDFA also, we look at rents, and landlords cannot charge rent that exceeds the fair market rent amount that is established by HUD. And then we also look at housing quality standards and per unit costs. All the units in the building must be upgraded to meet Section 8 standards and applicable state codes if you're using CDBG funding to do rehabilitation of those. And again, for per unit costs, we will be looking at how much funding or CDBG funding is being used per unit as a part of the review process. The next type of eligible activities are captured in our public facilities program. They fall into 3 subcategories: water and sewer, public property, and public services. So water and sewer eligible activities may include extending or replacing water and or sewer lines, constructing water or sewer treatment facilities, constructing water storage tanks or reservoirs, construction or replacement of wells, and the extension or the replacement of water and wastewater systems that serve medical facilities or nursing homes. But the key takeaway for water and sewer activities is that it has to be serving a primarily residential area. And again, like all the activities that we're funding through the New Hampshire CDBG program, it has to be benefiting predominantly low to moderate income individuals. The next type of activities funded under
Molly, if I can jump in here real quickly, we do have a question.
Great,
and so the
thanks.
question is, it says here on the slide, but also on the website, that water and sewer is an eligible activity. But how do you validate LMI eligible criteria when providing water to a community? They say they have a number of mobile home parks where town water is sold and a water management company that distributes and maintains the parks. Does the town have to interview and collect earnings from inhabitants? What's the process like?
That's a great question. So in a situation like a mobile home community or just a small pocket community maybe that needs some water and sewer upgrades, typically income surveys are used to determine the LMI percentage and make sure it meets that 51% threshold. It would depend if there is a cooperative or a nonprofit or a group that runs that park. That would be the entity to collect those. In some cases, it may be certainly the municipality that would be the one that would be responsible for collecting that data and determining if it meets the CDBG LMI standards. So if it isn't a resident-owned community, if it's just a neighborhood with a lot of mobile homes in it, it may be the municipality that would need to determine the boundary of the area that they're looking to do the upgrades are, the water and sewer upgrades, and then survey everybody within the boundary of that area to determine if the LMI requirements are met. All right. So the next kind of type of project that is funded under public facilities are facilities where public services are provided. So these type of activities may include the acquisition, construction, and rehabilitation of community facilities such as homeless shelters, community centers, or neighborhood facilities in which other public services are provided. Childcare centers also fall under this category. I want to note that the public facilities funding can only be used for infrastructure improvements, rehabilitation of the space. It can't be used for operating costs of organizations that are doing this type of work. It really is for construction or acquisition, those kind of hard costs that might be associated with this type of activity. And then lastly, public property is the last category under public facilities. Funds may be used for elderly or handicapped access to public buildings. It could be funds could be used to acquire or construct streets, sidewalks, etc. But for some, and I want to note that for some of these projects under public facilities, match funding is required, which we'll talk more about. For others, match funding is not required. And so again, we'll talk more about that in a moment. And lastly, under this section of eligible activities is economic development. The goal is to expand economic opportunities for low and moderate income individuals. So eligible activities under this category may include the purchase of equipments, and that is for nonprofit. The purchase of equipment is for profit only. Working capital, acquisition, construction, or rehab of commercial buildings, acquisition of land, employee training, public facility improvements, capacity building, and other associated things like that. So there are a variety of activities that HUD lists out that might be able to be funded using CDBG economic development funding. Also under this category is technical assistance to micro businesses. Micro businesses are small businesses that have 5 or fewer employees, including the owner. If those the individual that owns that business is low to moderate income individual, they may be eligible for technical assistance through the CDBG Micro Enterprise Program. That is a really strong program here in New Hampshire. There's a network of TA providers throughout the state that receives that funding and then turns around and provides excellent technical assistance to those small businesses located throughout the state. And so that is another area under economic development that type of activity that can be funded under economic development. In the last slide in this section, we just talk a little bit about ineligible activities. So there are some activities that are specified in the regulations as ineligible for CDBG funding. These include the general expense of conducting government. So unfortunately, if you have a aging town offices in your municipality, and you were hoping to use CDBG funds to help, renovate that space, that it would not be allowable, because those offices are used for conducting the general expense of conducting government. So that would be ineligible under CDBG. Again, construction of government buildings goes right along with that. That's that type of activity, unfortunately, cannot be funded with CDBG. Along with political activities, new housing construction, unless it meets those requirements that I mentioned earlier. The expense or operating and maintaining public facilities, which I also mentioned earlier, is not eligible. And then the purchase of personal property is not eligible. So again, the key takeaway for ineligible activities, I would say, is no construction of government buildings or spaces where the general government activities operate out of. And then again, remember that for public facilities, CDBG funding cannot be used for operating costs or general maintenance. It's more for rehabilitation or construction in those spaces. All right, I don't think any more questions have come in, have they, Julius? All right, so again, feel free to, I know I'm throwing a lot at you today. There's a lot of information here, so feel free to type any questions you might have into the Q&A as we go. The next section we're going to talk about is perhaps most important for the upcoming months, is the CDBG application process. CDFA administers several different CDBG programs throughout the year, which I've mentioned a little bit already today. Today, this presentation primarily focuses on the Housing and Public Facilities program. However, we have been and will continue to briefly review the other CDBG programs, including economic development, planning, and emergency resources. My colleague who's listening in on the presentation today, Molly Donovan, oversees our economic development and micro programs. And if you have questions specific to that we're not getting into today, feel free to reach out to her, and she would be happy to talk more with you about your funding needs to see if the CDBG economic development resources might align with that. So again, today we're talking primarily about the housing and public facilities programs. For those programs, there is a maximum amount of funding per applicant that can be received or requested and then received. I have that listed in the chart that you see here. So for housing and public facilities, the maximum amount you can request is $500,000. The only exception to that is for certain housing projects that have a that are technically permanent supportive housing, where there are services that are offered on site to residents. Those projects are eligible to receive slightly more. They can apply for up to $750,000. But general affordable housing projects are eligible for $500,000, and again, public facilities are can apply for up to $500,000. Those limits per applicant also are the maximum amount that any one municipal applicant can apply for in a program year. Sometimes, say a larger city might have one project come in at $500,000, and that means they can't fund another public facilities project again until the next CDBG program year. But sometimes there are projects that don't need that full amount. And so one project might need $250,000 and another project might need $250,000. So in that case, they could fund, potentially apply for and get funding for both those projects. But there is a limit to what any one town or city or county can apply for in each program year. The program year for CDBG runs July 1st to June 30th. So our July round that's coming up, that we'll be talking more about in a moment, is our first round actually of program year 2024. And then there's a second round in January. So that municipal funding limit would apply for those 2 rounds, and then next July it starts over and they could fund more projects if they already funded some in the current program year. And again, those funding limits, last thing I'll say about that is those funding limits apply to each program. So a municipality could come in and with a project that's requesting $500,000 for housing, and then they could also come in with a project that's requesting $500,000 for public facilities. So it's per program, not overall for CDBG. And I want to note our planning grants, which you can apply for our traditional planning grants, which are we make $25,000 available to project specific planning. We don't have any limits to how many of those can come in per municipality per year. So as I've alluded to a couple times now, we do have an application deadline coming up for our housing and public facilities program. Our first round of CDBG program year 2024 we are receiving applications. The due date is July 29th of this year. That is the last Monday in July. And those applications do need to be received here at CDFA by 4 p.m. that Monday. We'll talk more at the end of the presentation about how you specifically how you apply, but it's through electronically through our grant management system. And so that just needs to be submitted electronically again by 4 p.m. on that deadline day. And then again, we have a second round, a second opportunity to apply for funding the last Monday in January, which this coming year, that will be January 27th. And again, it's the same thing. It's by 4 o'clock, those applications need to be electronically submitted in order to be eligible to be reviewed in that round. And then that cycle will continue for the following year. We traditionally have 2 funding rounds per year for housing and public facilities. While those are 2 separate programs, we do run them concurrently. So we have our own allocation set aside for housing and public facilities, and there's separate scoring criteria that's used for housing and another criteria that's used for public facilities. But we do run those programs and those application rounds at the same time. So we talk about it as one, but it is technically 2 separate programs that we're accepting applications for and reviewing at the same time each year. The next slide talks about writing and administering your grant. So when you're planning to apply for CDBG funds, it's really important to think through your project, starting at the grant writing phase, through the application phase, and all the way to project implementation and completion. The grant writer and the grant administrator that you choose to help you with this process will play an important role from beginning to end. It guides your organization through the application process. And then on the flip side, if you're awarded funding, to successfully administering that CDBG funding and completing your project. CDBG trained grant writers and CDBG trained grant administrators must be procured by the municipality, and they can be funded through your budget that you are proposing for your CDBG grant. So again, if you are a nonprofit or a sub-recipient organization considering applying, you would not be the entity that would be hiring that CDBG grant writer and the CDBG grant administrator. That would be the municipality that you're working with is responsible for hiring those individuals. CDBG trained grant writer is recommended but not required, but all grantees, all people that are awarded funding, are required to hire a CDBG trained grant administrator for grant administration. And again, the funds the municipality uses to pay for that individual can come right from your CDBG grant. This next slide is a little busy, but I like it, not so much that you have to squint to see all the words on the little boxes, but just to illustrate that it is a process to apply for CDBG, and each of these boxes represents a different step of the process. The total process from CDFA approval to let me back up. It takes probably approximately 3 months from when you submit your application at the end of July to get to CDFA approval. And so staff will review applications, do multiple different reviews of applications, and then use the scoring criteria to score applications, and then recommendations are made to our Community Development Advisory Committee, or CDAC. That takes about 3 months to get to that point. Then at that point, once funding recommendations are made and approved by CDAC and then our board, it begins the next stage of the review process, which is that all of the contracts need to go through governor and council in order to receive final approval and for the project to be able to begin. So that takes an additional few months after the Community Development Advisory Committee approval for all of that administrative process to occur. So again, overall, it's important when thinking through your project timeline to consider that the funding, if awarded, generally is not available till about 6 months from when you submit your CDBG application. It takes about that long for the review and approval process to occur. One of the first steps that we do request that you start out with before you get into all of that is a pre-application meeting with us here at CDFA. We are happy to connect with you to talk more about, to learn more about your project and to answer any questions you might have about the CDBG program and the application process. For those pre-application meetings, we prefer that all individuals, or all entities, I should say, that are going to be involved in the application be on the same call. We do virtual meetings, so when I say call, I mean a virtual Zoom meeting where we want we'd like somebody from the municipality, somebody from, if there's a subrecipient organization, somebody from the subrecipient organization, and then also your CDBG grant writer, if that person has been identified at that time. It's preferable that all three groups come together and meet with CDFA staff to talk more about the project and get on the same page about next steps and what the application process entails. What happens is the municipality is the applicant, and so essentially they, along with the CDBG grant writer, are the ones that go in and submit the application through our grant management system. And then again, the review process that I began this slide talking about starts, where we have that internal review and then the GMC review stage that happens after those pieces. We'll talk more about the scoring process in a few more minutes in this presentation. So I don't think any questions have come in, have they, Julius, at this point? All right, so I'm going to keep talking at you for a few more slides, and then I promise I have some other colleagues that are going to jump in to talk about some of this information. But I'm going to talk about real quick about thresholds that are required to be met for these applications as part of this application process. So there are specific federal threshold requirements that must be met at the municipal level that include citizen participation and engagement. And this has to happen in advance of the application being submitted to CDFA. These requirements ensure that the local community is informed about the CDBG program and the specific request for federal funds to support a project within the community. So municipal thresholds include a required public notice regarding the public hearing that you are going to have about the project. That public notice has to be posted. There are very specific posting requirements that go along with where that needs to be posted. There are also public hearing requirements, and the purpose of the public hearing, again, is to inform the public about the CDBG program and your specific application. And then there is something called a housing and community development plan that needs to be adopted by the governing body of the municipality. And the plan identifies current housing and community development needs, or those anticipated in the next 3 years. That document, which we have templates for if your community doesn't already have one, that needs to be adopted prior to the application by the municipality prior to submitting the application. And then lastly, there is something called a residential anti-displacement and relocation assistance plan, which is a mouthful. Sometimes we refer to that as a RAH for short. But that plan must be adopted before obligating or expending CDBG funds as well. So we require that that's a project specific plan, and that needs to be adopted before the application is submitted as well. So those, upon initial review of your application, when it comes in here at CDFA, we are looking to make sure all of those steps have already happened and that you have all the required documentation to show that, that those steps were successfully completed. What we're also looking at when an application comes in is some specific application thresholds. So this additional documentation is required throughout the application to enable CDFA to further evaluate the application for readiness and to also understand the capacity of the grantee and the sub-applicant if applicable. These application thresholds include a complete application. We are making sure when it initially comes in that the application is complete, including having the UEI and other pertinent organizational information in the application. We look to ensure that all documentation that's needed to verify conformance to federal, state, and program rules and regulations is included. We look for documentation showing that the project meets readiness criteria. For example, state and local planning and zoning board approvals and other permits necessary to construct the project must be at least started and likely to be approved, with evidence of that included with your application. Information needed for CDFA to complete a grantee capacity assessment. And this assessment evaluates an applicant's capacity and performance to carry out a proposed project. So for prior grantees, this includes evaluation of the applicant's present capacity to undertake new projects and its prior performance with CDBG projects in the past. And then documents, we also review documents needed for CDFA to conduct grantee and subrecipient financial reviews. And this is to determine whether the CDBG funds are needed, and also that both the applicant and the sub-applicant have the capacity to successfully carry out the program on the project, on a financial side. And then lastly, we are also looking at for a completed compliance plan, which we'll talk more about in the next slide. And then also that there's documentation that the energy policy that we'll talk more about as well coming up is being addressed as part of your application. So for housing and public facilities projects, there may be other thresholds that must also be met that are specific to your project, and those will be addressed with you in the pre-application meeting if it's required, for those things to be included with your application, or they may be addressed with you at your site visit, which is one of the steps of the review process. Once your application is submitted, CDFA staff goes out and visits each project and has a site visit with them, and there may be some more documentation at that point that is requested of you to ensure that we can do a thorough evaluation of your application. So I'm going to stop talking at you guys for a few minutes and pass the presentation over to my colleague Chris Monroe, who's going to talk a little bit about that compliance plan that I mentioned. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Molly. Hope you get a little break, get some water and whatever else you need. So as Molly mentioned, I'm here to talk about a few additional threshold requirements for your CDBG application, one being the compliance plan, which will kind of be completed in collaboration with your grant writer, your project team. The compliance plan is a document that must be completed and uploaded with the application. The plan outlines how a grantee plans to address key compliance topics, which includes the national objective and eligible activity, as Molly talked about earlier, specific to your project, whether that's housing or public facility. Environmental review, which is a very critical component in your CDBG project. It's a pretty strict HUD requirement and needs to be completed before really any construction or typically we'd like to see it completed before any sub-trade bidding or procurement is completed for your project. So you have to touch on that. Your financial management structure, policy, kind of how you're going to meet the HUD and 2 CFR 200 requirements, procurement, labor standards, acquisition relocation, and labor standards would include Section 3 Davis-Bacon, other items that apply to that, reporting and record keeping, and monitoring and closeout. So when there is a subrecipient involved in the project, the municipality or the grantee needs to conduct what's known as a subrecipient monitoring. So basically the grantee takes a look at the subrecipient to make sure that they meet a lot of these requirements. We have a checklist for that we provide, and that has to be completed as well. So these all have to be, you don't have to have all of these items complete by the time of your application, but you do have to have this compliance plan in place, and the details of who is going to be responsible for these different sections and how you're going to meet the requirements outlined in these different sections. And additional details on each of those topics can be found on our resource hub, our resource website, which I believe was linked in the chat. And you can always reach out with any questions you might have during a pre-application meeting as well. We can talk about this. And again, typically your grant writer would be responsible for putting this information together, but it involves participation and collaboration between all the parties to make sure those requirements are met. And I've got a cat joining me now. You my little compliance helper. There you go. So next, I'm here to talk about the CDFA energy programs and energy policy. The programs offer support related to our clean energy standards, or different resources that we help people have access to. And then our energy policy is part of a threshold requirement for the application as well. So this will touch on those different things. CDFA provides several resources for applicants seeking to improve their facility's energy efficiency or add renewable energy, grants for energy related analysis, low interest financing, and CDFA technical assistance help applicants to build a better project. So particularly, with climate impacts on projects and various factors in the environment. Now more than ever, having energy efficient buildings, having comfortable buildings, resilient buildings is paramount. So we do provide resources for businesses and nonprofits and municipalities to pursue those goals. One being our Community Facilities Energy Assessment and Technical Assistance Program grant. Eligible municipalities and nonprofit organizations can apply for grants covering 75% of the cost of a community facility study. And this is a very easy application with approval in less than a week. And as it says, it supports eligible nonprofits and municipalities up to $6,000. So the process for that is we typically, Scott Maslansky is the director of this program. You would work with him or with myself, and I can coordinate that as far as completing an energy facilities audit or charrette, and you'd be able to understand more about the energy efficiency of your building or facility, and hopefully that would help inform any steps you might want to take moving forward related to improving your building envelope, or potentially adding solar, or upgrading your HVAC systems or adding heat pumps. We can certainly provide support in that. CDFA aims to ensure that our investments support projects working to reduce future operating costs, improving occupant comfort and health, and improving durability of facilities. CDFA developed our first energy policy in 2020 to make sure applicants to our programs assess these opportunities. And again, the energy policy is part of your CDBG application threshold. The following requirements apply to all CDFA, CDBG, tax credit, and clean energy fund applications, and to any project proposing a physical alteration to an existing system, including building envelope, mechanical systems, lighting, and items like that. or for new construction, which includes additions and gut rehabs and stud rehabs. Alternative types and levels of assessments are recommended by an accredited energy professional or organization, and those will be considered. New construction projects planning to reach LEED, Energy Star, Passive House, or Net Zero standards can waive requirement with documented intent from the design team, although an energy charrette is still recommended. So if, through the process of architectural and engineering design of your project, you're already addressing those standards or a higher standard of energy efficiency, if you provide that, that is for the most part sufficient to show that you're meeting that energy requirement. In some cases, if your project does not relate to an energy system, we do have a waiver process. You would work with Scott Maslansky through that waiver process, and we would review sort of the scope of your project and to make sure that a waiver is appropriate in those circumstances. The energy policy is available in our app and program guide, also on our resource website. This table shows the energy policy requirements. The two key requirements highlighted are that the applicant complete a level 2 energy audit and that you consult with the appropriate utility for potential implementation incentives. We want to make sure you don't leave potential funding on the table, as these funds could help improve the project design and future savings. We also have a set of recommendations, which you can see below. First is that projects try to incorporate any recommendations above energy code into their final design or equipment purchases. Second, we encourage high performance construction following guidelines to meet any of those standards. Third, that projects commission any new energy system. Commissioning is where a third party verifies that a system was installed correctly and trains building staff on how to best use and maintain the equipment. Fourth is that the design team considers transitioning from any fossil fuel systems to high efficiency electric systems. An example would be moving from an oil boiler to an air source heat pump, reducing site pollution, increasing opportunities for renewable energy to support the building's heating and cooling. And fifth, that projects look into opportunities for solar or other renewable energy systems. So again, those are recommendations. Those are best practices. We don't have that's not required as part of your CDBG application. We understand that, in certain instances, it can be cost prohibitive for an organization to incur those costs as a, result of their, kind of expanding the energy efficiency of their building. But that's also why we require that the utility companies are contacted, because if there is funding available, it can certainly help go towards those costs and really improve the design and function of your building. And then again, the requirements are highlighted on top, where the energy audit or energy design charrette are required. And again, consultation with the appropriate utilities, Unitil or Liberty or the electric co-op or any of those others. I don't know if the electric co-op would offer any utilities, but anyway, or incentives. But that's why you work with Scott or your team to contact the appropriate utility companies to identify any benefits. Water wastewater projects will also be required to examine whether an energy assessment is appropriate. It might not be applicable, but if you have, a pump station, if you have components of your water and sewer distribution and treatment systems that do utilize energy, we would want to make sure that you're addressing that as well, to make sure that you're, again, improving the sustainability of your infrastructure and reducing operating cost overall. The earlier your utility is aware of your project, the better position they are to offer incentives, which in some cases might impact your design or equipment choices. We will provide you with a list of utility contacts as well as energy consultants, and please let them know you're applying for CDFA funds, and they should be familiar with our programs. So the next steps related to the energy policy and requirements: you can review the CDFA energy policy with your design team, contact your utility representative to discuss potential support for your projects. Energy assessment grants, so you can contact Scott to discuss eligibility for community facilities energy assessment grant, CDBG planning grant, or New Hampshire Safe Support also possible. If needed, you can complete a waiver request form. This is now only needed if your project is not applicable to the energy policy. Submit the form prior to submitting your application. If your project won't be able to fulfill the energy policy requirements until after your application, you will now need to include a clear plan and timeline for completing your energy audit and communication with utilities in the energy portion of your CDBG application. So if it's, if it's prohibitive related to timing or design, or if there's a delay for whatever reason, that's okay. You just need to identify the plan to meet those requirements, should your application be funded. And for questions, you can contact Scott Maslansky. We want to make sure your projects are planning their energy assessments at the right stage of the project design, or you can also contact me as well, and I can funnel you over to Scott, or if it's an easy question, I should be able to help with that. This slide relates to the Inflation Reduction Act opportunities. For renewable energy nonprofits will be able to directly receive 30% tax credit towards solar installation, possibly 40 to 50% of certain low-income thresholds. There's energy efficiency benefits and other resources. So Scott, again, has kind of taken the lead in our organization of going through the Inflation Reduction Act and making sure that any opportunities that are identified in there can translate over to our projects and applicants. And that is Scott's contact information. And I'll take a moment to see if there are any questions or comments, fun facts, trivia, cat pictures, anything. All right. And with that, the next section involves evaluation and scoring. So I believe I'm turning that back over to Molly.
Thanks, Chris. All right, just bear with us a little longer. We're coming towards the end of the presentation now. I'm going to go through this next section kind of quickly, but I did want to touch upon how projects are evaluated and scored. So if the application is determined to be complete and meets all of the threshold criteria that we have just previously talked about, then it will enter the ranking and rating process. And this process is looking at these applications against other applicants that have also come into that round. So CDFA staff will rank all complete applications in accordance with the criteria that's outlined in the most current app and program guide. I am going to outline the criteria for each of these projects really briefly here, and then we will be sending out a copy of the most current application and program guide that will include these scoring criteria for each of the programs that you can review in a more detailed way, and let us know if there's any questions. So again, we are looking at is the applicant and sub-applicant eligible first and foremost, and does it meet the LMI national objective? Does the organization have the capacity to carry out the grant? This includes both the applicant, the municipal applicant, and the sub-applicant. The sufficiency of the grant request, that meaning, are there enough committed funding resources to complete the project? I should note here that all projects that are seeking CDBG funding should have all of their other funding in place at the time of application, and CDBG is meant to be the last in. So we need to see documentation. If your project requires match or exceeds, the total project cost exceeds the amount that we can award for CDBG, you have to have documentation of that other funding and that it's secured with your application, and we're going to be reviewing that. And then we are, of course, looking at all specific program area requirements, and we may reach out to you and request some additional information regarding that as part of the application process. So just be aware that sometimes that happens as we start reviewing what's included with the application. We find out we might have more questions and might need more info. I just want to touch briefly upon our core data index. This is a relative measure of poverty and other socioeconomic challenges by municipal level. This data set replaced the CDBG set factors that was previously used as part of the CDBG scoring criteria. That was based on some older census data. And a few years back, we moved to looking at this core data index as one of the scoring criteria in your CDBG application. We worked with the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute to assemble data from a variety of sources. The data is displayed at either the municipal or county level. And each data set deals with a specific topic such as poverty, population, or access to health care. So we that refers to our community progress indicators, and then we use those community progress indicators to serve as the basis for this core data index, which is the data set that we look at as part of the scoring criteria. And so the next slide, oops, sorry, I must have got, I tried to call out some slides, so I think I got rid of the second slide that previously was here. But I just wanted to note that we have a copy of the core data index as one of the appendixes of the or appendices as of the CDBG application and program guide. So you can look up, it's based on, if you're applying through the town, you look at the town core data index, or if you're applying through the county, you look up what the county number is. And that, as you can see, and the scoring, the housing criteria, which is in front of you right now, that is the first criteria that you're scored on, and depending on where you fall, you have no control over that as the project. We're just using that data that you'll find based on the location as part of your score. So this is just a snapshot of the different criteria that we're looking at as part of the scoring for housing. You can get a maximum, or by you I mean the project can get a maximum total 200 points. And we break up the areas that we score on based on, in addition to community needs, based on project specific needs, area housing needs, and capacity. And so again, we have much more detail about what specifically we're looking at in those categories in the scoring criteria section, which is part of our application and program guide that we'll be sending to you within the next week. So you can look at that prior to working on your application to see specifically what we will be scoring. This next slide just shows an overview of the public facilities scoring criteria. You'll see it looks very similar to the housing chart, but it is a bit different. There are some of the same criteria that are included in this, but there are some that are a bit different. Again, but it's also looking at a 200-point possible maximum score. And again, those details can be found in our application and program guide. And next, just wanted to briefly touch upon the economic development program and point out that the scoring looks a bit different for those projects. For those projects, scoring depends on the type of project and what kind of entity is implementing that project. So whether it's a business, a community, or a nonprofit organization. There's a minimum score for each category. There's 265 points for business loans, 250 points for grants to nonprofits, and for public infrastructure projects that support job retention. But again, in all cases, we just want to highlight that the project must result in the retention or creation of jobs. And so that criteria is a little different from the housing and public facilities program that we're talking about today. We also have the criteria for planning grants here. Currently, we're using the same scoring matrix for both our traditional planning grants, for our transformational planning grants. There is a maximum of 25 points. So you can see it's a much smaller point range for planning grants. And these criteria listed on the screen are what we're looking at as when we're scoring these grants. Planning grants can come in, they're accepted on a rolling basis. So they are not being scored against other applications typically. They are typically just being scored on the merits of the project itself, the application itself, not in relation to other projects like that's what happens in the housing and public facilities rounds. And then we have our emergency program, which I only briefly mentioned. In order to be eligible for emergency funding, projects must be able to demonstrate that the stated emergency occurred within the past 18 months. And they also have to meet minimum threshold requirements that's outlined in the corresponding program category. So really what emergency grants are for otherwise eligible housing and public facilities and economic development projects that can't wait for the next round to come in for funding because something unexpected has happened within the last few months, and they need to apply sooner than that to be able to try to get the project underway more quickly. And so we, the projects that that meet that kind of more emergent need will be reviewed and scored based upon the applicable criteria for that program. So say it's a housing project, it would be scored using that matrix that we just looked at a couple of slides back. Or if it's a public facilities project, we'd be looking, of course, then at the public facilities scoring criteria. In these cases, they're not being scored against other projects in the round because these come in on a rolling basis as the need arises. But we otherwise are, using that scoring criteria to make sure there's a minimum requirement for those funds. And then again, we're coming to the close of the presentation here. And so just a couple of key points that I want to leave you guys with for the housing and public facilities round as that's quickly approaching is that the applications for the upcoming housing and public facilities round are due the last Monday in July, which this year is July 29th. Again, those need to be submitted electronically by 4 p.m. Again, the review and scoring period will last from between August and October, and we'll go through the process that we've outlined today, review thresholds, evaluating and pre-score, site visits, and final scoring. And then the goal is to bring all staff recommendations for funding to our Community Development Advisory Committee meeting to their November meeting. They meet monthly, the first Thursday of each month. And so we aim to bring the funding recommendations from this July round to the November meeting. Then the next slide just shows you a snapshot of our CDFA website. And there is a portion of our CDFA website dedicated to our grants management system, or GMS, which you may have heard me refer to. That is the online system that you will use to apply and if you're awarded funding, manage your grant. And so you can access that through this section of our CDFA website. And then I just wanted to point out that, we have kind of two different landing spots on our website. We have, if you go to nhcdfa.org, you come to our main website. But if you click on the right hand, the gold button at the right hand top corner that says resource website, it pulls you to a different landing page where there's more detailed information about all of the programs, including a whole section, which you see here with my face right front and center. But you can see that there's different tabs and all the information that we're referring to today and talking about today. There's more detail about that's found in the program specific section of our resource website. So you'll want to go there if you haven't done so already to learn more about CDBG, but then also from that programs drop down menu at the top, you can look at our tax credit program, our energy programs, or any other funding opportunities that we might have. We have program specific information in this section of our website. And so I think that is the final slide of the presentation. And so again, I know we've talked at you a lot and this has been a whole lot of information, but hopefully it provides a helpful overview of the program. Well, first of our organization CDFA, and then the program CDBG, and then how to apply. As we mentioned, as Julius mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we will be sending out a recording of this presentation to all registered participants in today's webinar in about a week. So you can anticipate it by the end of next week. We'll be sending a follow-up email with a recording And then we'll also include links to our updated CDBG application and program guide that I've referred to several times, as well as our CDBG implementation guide, which has some more detailed information, both about national objectives and also about some of those compliance pieces that Chris talked about today. We have some more detailed information about the procurement process, the environmental review process, et cetera, outlined in our CDBG implementation guide. So you are going to want to keep your eyes out for that email that will be coming out. At the same time, when that email goes out, we'll also be, we plan to announce that the funding opportunity will be available and live in our grants management system. So you'll get the reporting, you'll get the links to the relevant materials, and then you'll also get notified that the funding opportunity for the housing and then for the public facilities program will be live on our grant management system, which means that you'll be able to go in and start working on an application at that point. I do want to note as well that we will also be including a copy of the application as an appendix to the CDBG app and program guide. So we haven't done that in the past. And so, previously, in order to see what the application questions were and what it looked like, you had to be logged into the grant management system. Now we're going to be adding a copy of that to the application and program guide, so you can get a idea of what that looks like and to see if that looks feasible as something that you could complete prior to logging on and creating an account with the grant management system. I'll note again that the only people that should be working in the grant management system are the person serving as the CDBG grant writer in the municipality. Those of you that are from the sub-applicant organizations would certainly be helping with the application and the application process, but typically there's only 1 to 2 people from the grant writer in the municipality working in the grant management system in order to streamline the process and to funnel it all through a single person. And so we're hoping that that copy of the application and the app and program guide will help those of you on the sub-applicant side to be able to start working on some of those application questions in preparation for sending those over to the individuals who will be entering it on your behalf into the grant management system. We only have a couple of minutes left, but I would want to pause now. We're at the end of the prepared presentation and answer any questions that you might have.
It doesn't seem like we have quite as many. I'm sure it was probably either the marathon or the fact that we gave them so much information. So the only thing that I could say is I remember from one of the previous presentations, there was a question about a particular public facility, and that was fire stations, right? It's a very popular question we get. Do you mind just touching on that real quickly, and we'll call that our closing question?
That's a great question, and it's something I didn't go over today is priority and prioritization of projects. And we do talk about this a little bit in detail under the scoring criteria section that I didn't go over that detail today. But it is an important question because there are a number of activities and types of projects that HUD says can be funded with CDBG. And it's a very long list of activities that includes things like fire stations and playgrounds and things like recreational areas that, as long as it's serving predominantly low to moderate income individuals, may be eligible for CDBG. But in New Hampshire, what we've done is to kind of try to focus that list a bit and to try to prioritize certain projects. We do have listed in our application and program guide the prioritization of projects that are essentially receive higher scores in the priority project area, and therefore are the types of projects we typically fund more often. And so while fire stations and playgrounds are technically eligible for CDBG, they're not often funded here in New Hampshire because we, for almost every round, get more applications than we have funding available to award. There is just a high need for great projects to be funded here in New Hampshire. So it becomes a competitive round with only not all of the projects being able to be funded. And so you'll want to take a look at your type of project and look at the application and program guide under the scoring section and see if your project is a high or medium priority. I would say if it falls in those areas, you should certainly consider applying. If it's a low priority area, you're more than welcome to still apply, but just know that it may make the odds of scoring high enough to receive funding, it may be just lower odds because we, again, have a lot of great projects that are seeking funding each round. And we only have about $1.3 to $1.4 million typically in each round to award. So again, if each project is requesting the maximum award amount of about $500,000, you can see that doesn't go very far as how many projects we can fund each round, unfortunately. All right. Well, if there's no further questions, I guess I'll close us out and say, again, I appreciate you taking your time this morning to spend with us and to learn more about the program. We are very accessible and would love for you to reach out to us with any questions after the presentation or to share this recording with anybody that you know that might have a funding need that might align with CDBG. We welcome, before you get to the a bit more formal pre-application meeting with everybody involved, if you would like to just individually reach out to myself or to any of my colleagues who you met today and talk a little bit more about your idea before making that decision to assemble the team and kind of move forward, we'd be happy to have one of those initial conversations with you as well. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Again, you can request a meeting through that tab on our website, or you can reach out directly to me. My email address is here